Damaged Defenders by Scherzam. Chapter 128. Bucky! The good news was that he remembered well before. Maybe not everything, but the vast majority of it, to be sure. Bucky was deeply thankful for that. Being able to remember his own name again, remembering Steve and their lives before the war? Yeah, Bucky was never going to bitch about that. Ever. He wasn't even going to bitch about pretty much everything past Steve rescuing him from Azano being either fuzzy or just gone. He remembered a few months of kicking Hydra ass in the war, but the last couple months were hit or miss, and he didn't remember that last mission at all. He knew the general gist of what had happened. Stuff went down, and Steve thought he'd died, mostly, but because he'd been told. He had a few fuzzy memories of some of his missions as soldier. The last half dozen were clearest, probably because they hadn't gotten buried under enough of whatever those guys had done to make him forget everything yet. Even those memories were nowhere near complete, though. He had a few snippets of other missions that lingered as well, for whatever reason. The couple vague memories he had of working with the child widows made sense, given there was one in the tower and Soldier had one as an ally on that last mission. The others... well, yeah, he didn't really remember names or faces, just things like the feel of a weapon in his hand, the angles of the light, a sense of heat or cold or wet, thanks to the weather, dumb stuff like that. No blood, no gore, no death. Not directly, anyway. He wasn't any kind of stupid, so despite not remembering it, he knew it was there, and definitely not any of the torture he knew he had to have been subjected to. Bucky wasn't stupid. If the memories of his life pre-Hydra hadn't gotten completely destroyed, the other stuff was there too. But Bucky was grateful it wasn't showing itself yet. The more time he got before that shit started coming to the surface, the happier he'd be. There was a reason for that gratitude, because he might not remember that stuff, but he was definitely dealing with the aftermath of it. On the good days, he could talk and more or less do his own thing, provided Steve was in line of sight. Neither of them had gotten over that need yet. The times being separated had been necessary, had been under hell, and had precipitated bad days on Bucky's side of things. Steve hadn't looked too much better once they'd reunited. And bad days sucked, to put it mildly. On the bad days, Bucky had to resort to writing or sign language to communicate because the idea of talking made him break out in a cold sweat. He couldn't tolerate being around anyone but Steve either on the bad days. On the worst days, he had to be ordered to do literally everything, which never stopped being humiliating once he'd come out the other side and was having a better day. And he couldn't sleep regardless of what sort of day he was having, not because he didn't want to either. He simply... literally could not. Like his body had forgotten the trick to it after so many years of enforced artificial so-called rest. Then there was the stuff that freaked him the hell out that in this context made no sense whatever. Like recliners. He couldn't get within 10 feet of one without breaking into a cold sweat. Tubs and showers both made him twitchy, which made getting clean some days a real challenge. If things were this bad without any active memories to back them up, Bucky sincerely didn't want to know just how bad it'd get once the memories started coming back. In short, it was ironic that his best days coincided with the days he could drag the soldier mentality out of storage and convince himself he was on a mission. Those days, Ship stopped fucking with his head because literally nothing had mattered to Soldier except completing his mission. Using that stuff against his ex-captors would probably never lose its appeal, even if or when the day came he no longer had to retreat into the soldier just to function. As things stood, well, that first go had gone pretty good for the most part. The actual fighting had mostly been fine, save that one flashback. The after, though, not fun. Clearly going in the soldier's gear had been a mistake. One Stark had evidently picked up on because he'd made Bucky a new uniform. It was virtually identical in looks to the old one. That said, the material was completely different. Much lighter, thinner, cut to allow him a lot more freedom of movement, and both arms were sleeveless rather than just the metal arm. Also, it had what was evidently the Avengers symbol on the chest and the buckle of the utility belt, done in a matte gray. And no muzzle. Not ever again. Steve had taken rather an unholy amount of glee in destroying that thing after they got back from storming the castle. Come to that, burning the soldiers' gear had been cathartic as heck all around when they'd done it a couple days after the raid. With the uniform problem settled, Bucky really didn't anticipate any problems with fighting in the future. Following Steve into a fight was, well, as natural as breathing. Pure instinctive, really. He'd been doing it literally all their lives. That he got to shoot the assholes that mess with him full of holes was a frankly awesome bonus. And thanks to Queen Frigga, Bucky didn't have to worry about any Hydra assholes turning him on the team. Bucky doubled and triple-checked the big-ass gun. Stark hadn't admitted to a name for it that Bucky had heard that he'd latched onto for the first raid. The thing was, well, gorgeous. The recoil would be an absolute bitch if he was normal, but he wasn't, so it wasn't a problem. And honestly, any gun that would let him tear fist-sized holes in people and throw grenades, yeah. That sort of thing spoke his language. Stark could have a fight on his hands if he ever tried to take it back. Beside him, Steve was checking his own big-ass gun, if a bit more slowly because he'd had less practice at handling the things than Bucky'd had, even discounting Bucky's time as soldier. The kid, Pyro, was down the way a bit, checking the ignition system Stark had made for the kid to allow him to do his thing. Remy, Gambit, was next to him, loading what, to the uneducated eye, looked like a very long and narrow quiver with packs of cards. Stark, apparently, had been looking into ways for those of the gang that used ammunition, whatever that ammo was, to have mass quantities of said ammo available without hindering their fighting ability. Stark's first attempt, where Gambit was concerned, was getting a trial today, evidently. It was almost the length of Gambit's back and only a little wider and longer than a standard playing card. Given that the thing rode directly over Gambit's spine, Bucky was willing to bet it was armored to protect that vulnerable chunk of human real estate. It also seemed to be jointed, probably so it would be able to follow Gambit as he moved. Barton and the Widow were down the way in the opposite direction from Pyro and Gambit, checking their weapons and other gear. Barton, for whatever reason, looked torn between being pissed as hell and thrilled to his toes as he examined his quiver. The only one not doing any prep was Wolverine, and he really didn't need to do any. His weapon of choice didn't require reloading, and he hadn't bothered with anything other than the claws during the last fight that Bucky had seen. Didn't really need to bother with anything else either. Having seen the claws, Bucky was pretty sure that the Wolverine had fallen prey to either Hydra or fuckheads who thought a lot like them, because there was no way those claws happened naturally. Really, someone kind of needed to inform the fuckheads of the world that doing that sort of crap backfired 9 times out of 10, and the fuckheads needed to stop doing it. Seriously, about 3/4 of the Avengers had been in enemy hands for a prolonged period at one point or another, and, well, said Avengers were, here. And in a lot of cases, the enemies that mucked with said Avenger weren't alive anymore. The rest just wished they'd been killed. Once everyone had checked their equipment and got their new uniforms, those that had them, on, Steve motioned everyone to the jet that was waiting for them on the roof. Barton and Romanov headed for the cockpit. As far as Bucky knew, they were the only ones qualified to fly the jet. Stark might have been qualified and kept it quiet, but thanks to his suits, it was unlikely that he'd ever be acting as jet pilot on a mission. They were going after one of the 3 other choices that Steve had been given when the Hydra news had been broken. Those had all been private airports in the middle of nowhere that Hydra used to transport stuff and people. This one in particular was in the middle of nowhere, Montana, while the other 2, that would be hit another day, were in the middle of nowhere, Siberia and Australia, respectively. Hitting those 3 would help to break some of Hydra's supply lines. It was also part 2 of the sending a message plan. Personally, Bucky was looking forward to hitting the Russian airport. He might not remember where Hydra had him stashed, but he did have several flashes of that airport. Thus far, he didn't have multiple memory flashes of any other transport method. That indicated to him that wherever he'd been kept was fairly close to that airport, forcing its fairly consistent use as a way to start getting wherever he was going. Of course, when it came to Siberia, fairly close was a relative term. The plane ride was quiet, with the gang mostly getting their game faces on, if they didn't have them on already, or simply concentrating on what they were going to be doing and the general plan, such as it was. Given what they were working with, the plan was pretty simple. None of the airports had much in the way of staff. According to Jarvis's snooping, as told by Stark, and really, Bucky was starting to get suspicious as hell when it came to Jarvis. There was the bare minimum number of people required for maintenance on the planes, a skeleton security crew, a spare plane crew, all of whom doubled as maintenance crew, and that was it. The airports depended more on their isolated locations and underground storage to hide what they were, rather than overwhelming numbers or fleshy security. Squashing the resistance wasn't going to be a problem, even without Loki's unique brand of assistance on their side. It was the underground storage that was going to be the problem. They had absolutely no way of knowing what all was down there. Unless they found a manifest somewhere, it could conceivably take months to open and examine every crate, which obviously was time they didn't have to spare right now. So they had two plans to deal with it. Plan 1, they found a manifest, could read it, and there was nothing of a toxic nature down there. Pyro got to burn the place to ash. Plan 2, there either wasn't a manifest, they couldn't read it in any kind of timely manner, or there was toxic stuff down there, and Pyro would melt the metal from the surface buildings and planes and use it to plug all access holes to the underground storage areas so nobody could get at it without a ton of effort. If necessary, Loki could teleport in extra scrap metal to ensure the whole thing was protected. From there, Jarvis would watch the sites like a hawk, Stark's words, until after Thanos was dealt with and they had time to sit down and think of a better, more permanent solution to the problem. Or just had the time to go through the crazy crate by crate. Barton warned them they were 15 minutes out, and Bucky finally turned his attention to his own preparations, by which he meant switching to soldier mode. And really, Bucky both wanted to cuss Hydra out and thank them for how Soldier worked. Soldier was, in a word, hyper-focused to hell and back. Literally nothing mattered save the mission. Granted, stuff could and did enter his awareness, but only if it either interfered with or aided the mission. And the reason Bucky was so torn about it was because that hyper-focus had built on, and exaggerated to a ridiculous degree, the hyper-focus that came naturally to a well-trained sniper, which is what Bucky had been back in the day. So it bugged the heck out of him that Hydra had used part of his own nature against him, while at the same time it was a relief because it made it easier to get that hyper-focus back when he needed it. Soldier cocked the gun he'd been issued and ensured the safety was off as the jet landed, then slotted himself into position behind Roger's left shoulder. The bulk of the strike team flowed off the jet the second the ramp was far enough down to permit it. Their targets were assembling in force in front of the sole airplane hangar at the facility, armed with whatever weapons they'd had to hand. Soldier was aiming and shooting the moment he had a clear field of fire. Blazing magenta projectiles flashed past Soldier from behind as Gambit joined the fray. Roger's gun started firing a few moments after that, his action slower and more staccato than Soldier's, evidence of Roger's general lack of practice with weaponry. A few seconds after that, more and much steadier and smoother gunfire from a lighter gun sounded from behind, indicating the Black Widow had completed her pilot duties and joined the battle. A second later, a hail of arrows joined the melee as Hawkeye joined the fight. Soldier still wasn't completely sold on the efficacy of such an archaic weapon, but he was willing to allow that arrows were certainly an unexpected quantity in a battle. Unexpected quantities could and did win battles.